Hello and welcome to the North East Law Review. My name is Nathan Cooper. As always, I'm joined by Becca Bestley, and today we are fortunate enough to be joined by two special guests. We're joined namely by Dr. Ruth Houghton of Newcastle Law School and Professor Aoife O'Donoghue of Durham Law School. And they're going to be speaking to us today on their specialist topic and a paper which they wrote entitled Our World, a Feminist Approach to Global Constitutionalism. Now, thank you both very much for finding time to speak to us in your, no doubt, very busy schedules. We really appreciate that. Now, before we get into the paper itself, we just wanted to ask a couple of background questions about your individual routes into law. So how you ended up at Newcastle and Durham Law School, respectively, and what influenced the decisions to enter into legal academia. So we'll start with Ruth.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for having us both today. So prior to working at Newcastle Law School, I did my PhD at Durham Law School under the supervision of Aoife, and that's how we've come to work together today. My decision to enter into legal academia was I guess quite more long-winded than most. I'd started my degree in English and history at the University of York and later converted to using the GDL at the University of Birmingham. And it was during that time that lecturers were suggesting to look into masters. And so I went off to UCL and did a master's in international law. The plan had been to go into practice, but during the time when I was at UCL, I was fortunate enough to get a research assistant position with Lord Collins, where I was working on his research into the Act of State doctrine. And I think it was that, combined with what I'd done in my degree at York, where it was very research driven, that convinced me that perhaps my interests sort of were in research. And that's when I decided perhaps practice wasn't for me and that I would go and try and apply for a PhD. And the rest, as they say, is history. And that's how I've ended up here doing this kind of law meets literature and international law research.
And Aoife, same question. How did you end up at Durham Law School, and what influenced you into entering into academia?
So I did my degree I'm from Ireland, so I did my degree in Cork, where I'm from, and I did a law degree with a year abroad. So I spent a year in the States studying law there, and I never wanted to practice, so that was never on the cards for me. I thought I'd be interested in law, but I didn't think I'd ever really want to practice law. And I thought I wanted to be a diplomat. So because I wanted to be a diplomat, I did all the international law subjects because I figured that would be useful to know. So I did a master's in London and City. I did my master's there in international law. And I came home and I started applying to do the civil service exams. And I was just doing a secretarial work in a solicitor's office. And a job came up in NUI Galway. And I had one friend who was already doing some research work in Germany. And so I already knew somebody had started working in the university. And I saw the job and I thought, well, while I'm waiting to do the civil service exams and studying for that, I'll go get this job. I had taught swimming, but that was about the extent to which I had done any sort of teaching before that. So I got the job. It was originally a one-year job to teach contract and equity. And I started in January. It was a bit of a breath of fire, but I did enjoy it. It was really interesting. And that contract was extended for a few years after that. And by the time I kind of got to year 3, I decided I didn't want to be a diplomat and that I would prefer to be an academic full time. And at that stage, actually, quite a few of my friends had started in academic positions in various places and started PhDs. My group of friends from university were very unusual in that a huge amount of us went into academia, and that's fairly unusual. But I think because one person did it, the rest of us thought, oh, maybe I could. So I think sometimes it can be a bit of a mystery as to how people end up there. So I actually so a job came up in Durham and I applied for it, and it was teaching international law, which is what I wanted to do. So I got a job originally with a contract, and then I became permanent in Durham. And I actually started my PhD at the same time as I started working in Durham. I did it at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, but I did it as an external student. So I did it while working full time. So I did it in a fairly non-traditional way of going about entering academia, but it worked for me.
It's come up briefly, but we just wondered how you two ended up working together and collaborating on this paper.
Yes.
You can go first, Ruth.
So I did my PhD on global constitutionalism and particularly looking at the question of democracy within that literature. And we were coming towards the end of that project and thought we should write something. And so the kind of theme that was emerging was a gap, I guess, within global constitutionalist literature for a feminist intervention. There are feminist approaches to international law. There is a wealth of literature on feminist approaches to comparative constitutional law, but in the, what was a fairly nascent field of global constitutionalism, there wasn't a feminist intervention. And so we started to think and reflect on whether or not we could build something on that theme. So it was around the same time that Aoife was invited to contribute to an edited collection on feminist interventions in international law. And so we thought that we could put together a feminist manifesto for global constitutionalism. And our project then on feminist approaches to constitutionalism and global constitutionalism has taken a number of different strands. The paper that we're talking about today, Our World, is just one of those.
That's good. So getting into this paper, getting to the Our World, a feminist approach to global constitutionalism paper itself, could you please describe what is actually meant by the global constitutionalism in terms of the wider debate? And can you say, in your view, why you feel this fails to adequately represent the interests of women? So if we go with Aoife on this one, please.
So global constitutionalism is sort of an advance on what used to be called international constitutionalization. So in the kind of mid to late 90s, there was a lot of debate and discussion about how international law might be kind of following in the steps of EU law and increasingly becoming a much more complicated public law type order with the same sort of features that you would see in a domestic order. It was very much based on liberal ideas of constitutionalism, but very little of it was critical at all. It was very positive. There was very little questioning about whether or not constitutionalizing the global order would be a good thing or not. And it was, what it tended to do was it would take bits of international law, bits of constitutional law, put them together, sometimes in really interesting and innovative ways. I mean, it was an interesting, it used to madden me, but it was an interesting debate, or it is an interesting debate because it's now global constitutionalism. It's spread into not necessarily saying that there's going to be a constitution for the world and that it's the UN Charter or it's the UN Charter plus the WTO, but rather that there's elements of what you could call constitutional law there, rather than saying this like, it's saying perhaps maybe it's more like the UK constitutional order in that there's not like one document, there's lots of different documents. But even then, there's very few people would say now there is a constitution, in a way that they might have said 15, 20 years ago. But what we find is that it took bits from both orders, but didn't take any of the critical elements. So within international law, there is, as Ruth said, there's lots of feminist interventions in international law. There's what's called TWAIL, or third world approaches of international law, that talks about imperialism and how colonialism still has a lot of ramifications in the international order. So there's lots of different perspectives, and the same in domestic constitutional law. Like there's lots of different, feminist critiques and critiques around materialism or Marxist critiques, ideas of hegemony or elitism. So, but all of those were ignored. So it was the global constitutional debate was very positive. Constitutionalism is great, but seemed to forget that both the bits that they were taking things from were actually full of critiques. So it was ignoring all of those elements.
So you chose science fiction as a way of furthering global constitutionalism. Can you tell us why?
Yeah. As we mentioned previously, we sort of were working on a manifesto that was going to offer this 7-point intervention to highlight the way in which global constitutionalism might be able to inculcate some of that feminist critique from domestic constitutional law and international law. Now, there is a very close relationship between manifestos and utopianism. And so in sort of trying to explore that relationship between manifesto as a form of utopian text, you will come upon the use of science fiction literature and the relationship between those. So for example, in the 1970s, feminist movements in the 1970s have, produced science fiction literature. You can see that from kind of ecofeminism. You can see that from other works such as Ursula Goren. And what we sort of identified from that is, whereas manifestos will be seen as a form of, political intervention, your science fiction literature, your other form of utopian text, isn't taken seriously as a piece of political intervention, unless it's written by Thomas More. Or one of the other kind of canonical utopian literature writers, where it then becomes a piece of literature that one can study and build a political philosophy from, or to offer a kind of meaningful insight into the way of structuring the world. And that just doesn't happen with the feminist science fiction texts. And so our starting point was to controversially ask and proffer that these could be meaningful, serious political texts that global constitutionalist scholarship should engage with seriously, for the ways in which they offer up questions around community, constituent power, the public-private divide, the way in which we structure society.
I think science fiction there's a lot of parallels with science fiction in that, science fiction not being taken seriously as a genre, so, it doesn't get put forward for lots of the literary awards. And this happens to lots of genre writing, so crime writing, this happens to as well. So similarly with feminist manifestos, the feminist texts, and then within science fiction, feminist science fiction is taken less seriously, and within manifestos, women's manifestos are taken less seriously. So in lots of ways, they mirrored each other. Because if you think of something like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is a dystopian piece of science fiction, or even very popular science fiction like Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica, they are considered to be reflections of the world and political commentary on the world. But when it comes in a feminist form, it often gets dismissed, or if they have anything in it that is in any way negative, like something like Naomi Alderman's The Power, it seemed to be awful and dystopian, because it creates a world where men often always live in fear of violence, while forgetting that that's actually the normal world that women live in every day. So it's the reception and the understanding of what women are saying in the science fiction that actually is often mirrored, that the same kinds of things happen in both genres. And also, I like science fiction, so that helped. I will say, I'm a fan, so that made it a bit easier, because it also meant we got to read loads of science fiction, and watch a lot of science fiction. And I think sometimes when we think about research, you're supposed to enjoy it, so there's nothing wrong in sort of saying, and one of the nice things about being an academic is you do get to actually do the things most of the time. I mean, sometimes you end up researching things that I don't really care, but and that's why being a student is helpful, because you're able to get through to the end of those things. But it's it's being able to pick something that you're actually genuinely politically very much attracted to, but also just from you enjoy. It doesn't become a hardship to make your way through hundreds of manifestos at this point, and science fiction texts.
How significant do you guys imagine that the historical literature will be going forward in informing the wider debate? These historical texts you've been looking at, and how much do you think they're able to challenge these canonical narratives you're referring to in the wider global constitutionalist debate?
Well, I think they're really informative from a few different perspectives. One is that some things are very similar, very same, the concerns. One of the ones we're looking at is the Lowell factory girls. And they worked, it was one of the first trade union strikes in the United States. And these were very young women. They were teenagers, but the Lowell factory itself had run education programs. So they're extremely articulate. They, they've been working from a very young age, but they set out, and it's stuff, they want respect in the workplace. They want to be able to work without being, basically sexually harassed. They want to be paid properly for their work. And what's remarkable is you're reading something that's, written in the 1800s, and it seems a long time ago, of very young women living a very different life to me, but at the same time, it seems familiar. And obviously the context is different, and you don't want to claim that it's exactly the same, because of course it wasn't. They didn't have a right to even vote at the time. But I think especially with the ideas of feminist communication, the idea of women talking to each other across time, I think that comes across very strongly in these texts. I think with the looking at the canon, and I think that's not something that has been very strongly looked at in international law or constitutional law, is the construction of a canon and what we give weight to and why we give weight to, and what we decide they get weight because of their context, but we never question the context. So you say, everybody reads Dicey because when the time Dicey was writing, there were only male dons in Oxford and Cambridge, and that's who was important. But actually, if you go back to that period, he's also writing about feminists and saying how wrong they are. So Dicey is fully aware of the feminist movement at the time and the suffragettes, and he's anti them. But the context is a context where women are pointing out that inequality is there and that they are as human, and same with anti-racist texts. There's less of that in Dicey's own writing, but he's living at a time where that's happening. And the same with international lawyers, who the American Association of International Law didn't admit women when it was created in 1906. But in 1906, when you actually look at the context, you can see women had been practicing in federal courts in the United States for 30 years at that point. So when you do look at when we create the canon and we say it's fine because of its time, what these feminist manifestos demonstrate is actually, if you look at what's happening at their time, they are these documents that were well known, that were maybe people dismissed them and moved on for them, but something, if you go back, say, to Olympia de Gouges, who wrote at the same time as The Rights of Man about the rights of women, and was actually guillotined because of her. Like, they were that afraid of her that she was guillotined during the revolution by other revolutionaries for suggesting that the rights of men also meant the rights of women. So I think in looking at these older contexts, we can talk about now and say, well, we believe X, Y, and Z because we believe that these canon texts, maybe have been more problematic, but it's okay because of the context of when they're written. Whereas our work is demonstrating, actually, in the context in which they were written, there were these other voices there, and history and law and the people at the time chose to ignore them. That was an active political choice. I think it's much more important to say that than rather go, it's okay because everybody was a misogynist in the 1800s. They weren't, so it's important, I think, in that sort of way, in the 1700s and obviously the 20th century too.
And I guess what's an important point to build on that is those canonical texts have informed the foundational norms or concepts within constitutional law and global constitutionalism. So if we talk about constituent power, the literature will always say, well, we need to go back to CS and we need to work out what CS defined constituent power as, which is that power to construct a constitutional order. And yet, as Aoife is saying, at the same time, you have de Bruges' rights of women, which would have problematized, or does problematize, our concept of a constituent power holder and who has the right to participate in the construction of that constitutional order, who has the right, on the flip side, to protest and fight against the constitutional arrangement for reform. And so, you know, you've almost embedded those canonical literatures within our foundational cornerstone norms and concepts within global constitutionalism. And so looking at those feminist texts that protest them or intervene means that you have to question those fundamental concepts and norms as well.
Your next work on the project intends to look at the role of manifestos. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so as Aoife mentioned, there's a special issue that we're working with scholars looking at the role of manifestos, feminist manifestos in global constitutionalism, that we will be submitting to the journal Global Constitutionalism. And it's been fascinating to work with our collaborators and learning about the different manifestos that they're working with. So our colleague Sherry is looking at a manifesto that she found by chance in an archive at the ILO from 1924, where a women's organization had been put forward, I guess, of a different way of ordering international law, a different way of doing world governance, and how, almost looking back, devastating it is that was ignored and filed away, given that was on the cusp of world, of what would have been World War II, or the lead up to that in the 1920s. Our other colleague, Juma, is looking at the role of manifestos in India, and the relationship between the protest, the manifesto form, and the opportunities for legal reform. So one of the questions we wanted to ask was that very relationship, and looking at when do those voices get taken up and when do they get sidelined and ignored as being too emotional, too angry, too irrational. And then our colleagues, Gina and Lucia, are going to look at, in part, those manifestos that aren't texts. I mean, we sort of came at it originally with a kind of text-heavy understanding of manifestos, and certainly when you look at collections of manifestos that you do have, feminist manifestos, they are text-based, albeit a number of them are what you would call ephemeral, which is kind of those bits and pieces of paper that have been collected in personal archives or found in the back of a shoebox from somebody's collection. And so Gina and Lucia are going to look at non-text based manifestos that you might find, for example, in Aboriginal art, to demonstrate that even our focus on manifesto text is to exclude and to overlook and to marginalize those forms of protest that come in non-text based. Yes, and then finally, our colleague Emily is a scholar whose expertise lies in posthumanism, and so she's going to be looking at how pretty much all of our conversations around feminist manifestos can be critiqued or looked at differently from this perspective of posthumanism. So really looking forward to learning about the ways in which we could have rethought our 7-point manifesto from a different feminist starting point than the one we adopted.
So which of the feminist writers' work made the greatest impression on you in the course of your research, and why? So Ruth, you mentioned earlier You mentioned Ursula Goren, you've mentioned previously Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And I wanted to ask individually which one was the most impressionable and why. So we'll start with Ruth.
That's a great question. I think possibly for all the wrong reasons. It probably is Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and that's because it's a very problematic text. The background behind Gilman as a writer is that she was a supporter of the eugenics movement, and that will inform your reading of Herland. Herland is a text where three male explorers are determined to find this land that they've heard of, which is run entirely by women, and they set out on this great travel and enlist indigenous people to help them find this hidden Herland. And the story then follows the fallout when these three men infiltrate this women's only world. And that the conversation around reproduction, the way in which these characters reproduce, it's hard not to read it and be informed by her opinion on eugenics. And so you have to place it within her personal context, and it is very much informed. The racism within the text as well, so the way in which race is discussed is hugely problematic. But what that text did allow us to do was to demonstrate the way in which these utopian texts can be problematic, and the gaps that they leave us. And that led us then to other works that we could read to problematize those texts.
I think probably for me it's Ursula Goren. We used in the article we used The Left Hand of Darkness, which is a really interesting book, but a book again that isn't without issues. And what I think attracts me to Ursula Goren is that Ursula Goren, in writing about her and talking about her work, she died fairly recently, is happy to revisit it and talk about the problems in her own texts and how, writing it now, she would write something different and why, in a way that I find really really interesting. That she was very happy to talk about. So in The Left Hand of Darkness, there's one human character, and he goes to this planet where everyone is ambisexual. You manifest sex once a month, and it could be male or female, so you could be both a father and a mother, but she used the male pronoun for them all. And she, in writing about it later, she wrote a short story about 15-20 years later where she changed that, because she said, actually, and it is quite a revolutionary book, it is the way it questions basically our canonical understanding of who we are and how we operate and how we decide what roles. And there's a section in it where it becomes announced that the king is pregnant, and the human visitor realizes that he's laughing because they said the king is pregnant, whereas everyone else is laughing because they think the king is too old to be having children. So because for them it has nothing to do with, because sex doesn't actually manifest itself. In the Earthsea trilogy, where she said that when she originally wrote it, she couldn't imagine a woman as a wizard, because Earthsea trilogy is more fancy. Said that she could have written it with female wizards from the beginning, but that she, at the time of writing, she had read, all of that had been always male characters, and then her envisaging of what was possible had been limited by what had been presented as canon. And I think her ability to do that, to question herself, and I think as an academic, I think that's really important, to be able to go and say, actually, I wrote that thing 10 years ago. Now I'm not so sure about that thing I wrote 10 years ago. And this is why. It's because I've learned from other people. And I think that's it's a feminist methodology, to not assume you're right and that you will be right forever for everybody. Though I will also give a quick shout out to N.K. Jemisin and the Broken Earth trilogy, because she's a contemporary science fiction writer, and her books are amazing. I can't recommend them enough. And she very much is a fan of Ursula Goren, but she also challenges Ursula Goren. Ursula Goren wrote a book about walking away from Olamus, where you walk away from a utopia because you find out the secret at the heart of the utopia is a secret of horror and torture and inhumanity. So you walk away, whereas N.K. Jemisin rewrote the story, and instead of walking away, you stand and you fight to change it, which I think is a lovely way of encapsulating the different perspectives, because N.K. Jemisin is an African-American writer. She doesn't get the privilege of walking away from a situation. She has to live through living in a racist society where she is constantly challenged as a woman and as a Black woman and as a Black woman writing science fiction, which is another huge hurdle again. So I like to give a big shout, because her work is it's amazing. I can't recommend it. Even if you have no interest in feminist manifestos or Law and Utopia, I highly recommend those books anyway. And Ursula Goren, frankly, as well. Herland, maybe not, unless you're really interested.
Yeah, I think one of the important points there to pick up on the Ursula Goren and N.K. Jemisin conversation was the conversation between the texts, and the way in which they do respond to one another, and how that was part then of what feminist practice could be, in terms of bringing that to the front of our approach to feminist global constitutionalism. And so one of the things that we do in the article is we stop, and there's a purposeful pause where we sit, or just a silence, where we identify that we're not the authoritative voices on what would be feminist global constitutionalism, and certainly not what should be a feminist utopian discussion around global constitutionalism, and that actually it's the conversations, it's about learning from one another and identifying the gaps of our own knowledge, and that will actually enable us to start a feminist conversation about global constitutionalism, and that was kind of informed by the way in which these texts speak to one another as well.
I think informed by Herland as well, and the role of white feminists,
yes,
which has been to silence Black feminism and subaltern feminism and women from the global south, and assume leadership and assume knowledge and assume that we know what's right for all women when we don't.
Yeah.
And I think in lots of ways it's learning from Herland that white feminism has been involved with a huge amount of harm, and leaving that silence to say, we absolutely acknowledge that this is not, we don't want to become the new canon. We don't want to replicate all that's happened, and that's a serious part of what we're trying to do here is not replicate what white feminism has and still does to a huge extent. I mean, it's still happening. It's not that that's in some bad past. That's a present problem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth and Aoife, for joining us today. Hope to see everybody next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.